The 16-year-old John D. moved to Cleveland, then becoming a major railroad and commercial hub. It was as an accountant that he began his professional life.
When he went to Cleveland as a young man, his father told him that it really wasn't important for him to go to college. He wanted to go to college, and his father said, no, it would be much better if he went to a trade school, because then he'd learn something useful where he could earn a living. And so, in fact, he learned to become an accountant.
He joined the firm of Hewitt and Tuttle, but when he was refused a raise, he started his own company selling produce. Trade generated by the Civil War and the opening of the West made a success of this first venture. Rockefeller's business personality was now set.
His friends called him the Deacon. He was a kind of pious and also a very serious and stern, sober figure. People would ask him, what are you going to be when you grow up? And he'd always answer, never with a profession. He'd say, I'm going to make $100,000.
As oil boomed, Rockefeller realized that this was the field for him. In 1865, he went into a partnership with an experienced oil refiner, the Englishman Samuel Andrews. Refining oil made more sense to Rockefeller than drilling for it. Wells dried up, but every driller needed a refinery.
The amount of capital needed to go into the refining business in, say, 1862 was very small. I mean, you essentially set up a small still in your backyard and you were in the refining business. John D. Rockefeller nevertheless believed that it's important to be big.
And the company got very big. Rockefeller understood that the bigger the company, the cheaper its costs, the greater its profits. And he grew big through attention to detail. For example, to save money, the company began to make its own oil barrels. And then Rockefeller discovered a way to save even more.
You can imagine the kind of efficiency that somebody who had done something with his life like Ledger A would bring to an enterprise. One of the things he did, he would go around and see the people soldering the oil barrels, and he found that they were putting 40 drops of solder in. And he said to one guy, he said, will you please try 38? And the guy tried it, it didn't work, but 39 did. 39 was perfect. Later on in his life, he would recall this, John D. Rockefeller, and he'd say, a fortune we saved, a fortune. What he was concerned with was not the fortune he made, but the fortune he saved.
The company grew by buying up refineries. And the bottom line grew further through a range of oil byproducts. Rockefeller would see nothing of the refining process wasted. John D. Rockefeller formed Standard Oil in 1870, and from delivery to storage, wherever middlemen had operated before, Standard stepped in. Of course, as he put it, we made a fine crop of enemies by it too, but we made oil far lower in price than it had ever been before. By the late 1870s, John D. Rockefeller was a millionaire many times over. Rockefeller's most important deals were with the railroads that took his oil to market. He represented such a large volume of business that he was able to force them to pay rebates.
From the beginning, John D. Rockefeller saw that he had a kind of common partner in the railroads. The railroads had an interest in this oil running smoothly, being produced and refined smoothly, so that it didn't come in dribs and drabs and unpredictably. And so he made an arrangement that would profit him and really help destroy the competition. And one of the things he got for himself were rebates. That is, for every barrel of oil shipped, he got a certain number of dollars back off the shipping fee because of the volume that he was shipping. And his competitors, these small competitors, didn't get that. And then he made a further step in the economics of strangulation in coming up with the railroads with this concept of the drawback.
The drawback system was a kind of extortion. The railroads had to pay Rockefeller a percentage of the shipping fees his competitors were paying them. It was illegal, of course, but no railroad dared object.
And what this obviously did is it made it more difficult for competitors to use the same railroad. It's a way not just of getting the best price yourself, but frustrating the competition.
By the early 1880s, Standard Oil controlled 95% of the refining business. Rockefeller's reputation for being ruthless now spread as wide as his corporation. His business practices were legal, like swallowing up competitors, questionable, like spying on them, and illegal, like the drawbacks. And anyone with the guts to compete could count on a visit from Standard to discuss a buyout.
He would have his people evaluate the worth of their properties, issue stock, that matched his evaluation of what their properties are worth, and they could take it or leave it. So he would print a piece of paper that said, here's 100 shares of Standard Oil. You are now a junior partner in a company of which I am a senior partner. I may never declare a dividend, and you can't sell this to anybody.
He did buy out, and in some cases force out of business other people. But when he did that, he would offer them either cash or Standard Oil stock.
Did he give them any choice? Sure, you didn't have to take his stock, but if you didn't take his stock, your oil, he could show you, was going to cost more to refine than his because his was the biggest refinery in town.
He said, I always offered them stock in Standard Oil. And if they turned that down, that was their mistake. And of course, technically, he was correct, because Standard Oil went on to be this, huge thing, and they would have all been millionaires. He created endless numbers of millionaires. But he didn't go to the other side of it, that is, if they didn't accept the stock, then he put them out of business. He just bought them out.
In his private life, meanwhile, he had married the strong-willed Laura Spellman in 1864, and they'd had 3 daughters in quick succession. But it was their 4th child, John D. Jr., born in 1874, who Rockefeller hoped would one day take over the firm. Despite his Puritanism, Rockefeller bought a large home on Cleveland's fashionable Euclid Avenue. And he built a 700-acre country estate, Forest Hill, which he characteristically hoped would someday turn a profit as a hotel. He even surprised at least one business associate with a bill after a visit, but eventually accepted the notion of the nonprofit home. But he never lost his deep commitment to religion. He had been a trustee of the Euclid Avenue Baptist Church since the age of 18. Nor did Rockefeller ever see a conflict between his faith in God and his faith in monopoly capitalism. The good Lord gave me my money, he would say, and the future promised ever more benevolence from above. 26 Broadway, New York City. John D. Rockefeller moved his Standard Oil headquarters here in 1882 to be at the center of what was becoming a global enterprise. In time, it would become the most famous business address in the world. New York in the 1880s was a city of old money and new wealth. Society was dominated by the likes of the Astors and the Vanderbilts, but John D., worth over $250 million by the middle of the decade, lived as simply here as he had in Cleveland. He even took the elevated train to the office and joined none of the businessmen's clubs. Instead, the family enjoyed a quiet and pious home life at the modest townhouse they built on unfashionable 54th Street. Laura Spellman and John D. had in common a deep commitment to righteous behavior. Her family home had been a stop on the Underground Railway, and John himself had once paid for a black woman's freedom.
There was a fierce sense of right and wrong in both my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother. It was not so much a matter of some kind of a public statement, of just a personal commitment, and probably not thought to be all that heroic, just something that you ought to do because it was right.
One of the most remarkable things that grandfather did was to establish Spelman College, which is college for black women in Atlanta. And he did this back in the 1880s, before people were interested either in blacks or in women. They may have been interested in women in a different way, but not in the way that they are today.
And now that his wealth was growing, he could express his righteousness by giving freely, and he poured millions into the Rockefeller Institute, making it one of the world's premier institutions of medical research. And in 1889, he donated $600,000 to endow the University of Chicago. Over the next 10 years, he would give $45 million to the school. Inevitably, his motives for such huge gifts were suspect.
It was important for him to be righteous and to be seen to be righteous. I think that this was an attempt to control his fate, to make a bargain with the Lord, that if he did the right thing with his nickels and dimes and pennies, perhaps in the great beyond, the Lord would be good to him.
Sometimes people have said that the only reason that he gave lots of money away was because he was trying to atone for what he had done in earning a lot of money through Standard Oil. He felt a sense of responsibility to use it intelligently, but the notion that he was trying to atone for something that he felt he had done that was wrong, it just is not true.
As it happened, it really didn't matter how much money he gave away. His nearly total control of the vital oil industry made him the perfect embodiment of capitalism gone mad. There was scarcely any disagreeable creature with which Rockefeller was not compared in the political cartoons of the era.
Everybody thought that John D. Rockefeller was impervious to this criticism he was taking. I mean, he was the most hated man in America, certainly, perhaps the most hated man in the world. His name was synonymous with ruthlessness. And it was assumed that he was just a kind of this steely facade. But inside, of course, it was taking its toll.
He suffered digestive problems, and in 1901 he contracted alopecia, a total loss of body hair that can be congenital or a nervous disorder. Whether it was the public outcry that took his hair, his sense of order dictated a series of wigs of different lengths to emulate natural hair growth. If Rockefeller was already the object of vilification, Ida Tarbell only made matters worse. In articles for McClure's magazine that began in 1902, the noted muckraker depicted his company's tactics as cutthroat and his character as a portrait in greed. But America needed little convincing that the power of men like Rockefeller was way out of hand.
I think the public concern about big business and the reaction to Standard Oil and to Rockefeller that was caused by that concern was really due to a feeling of loss of control. When we change from a small business and agricultural society to a society in which many people are employed by a big company, we give up a lot of control over our own destiny. And people felt out of control. That was one reason people feared big business. So I think that that concern is part of what made people so angry at Rockefeller.
The president, Teddy Roosevelt, was the point man in the effort to bring Rockefeller down. In spite of his own privileged upbringing, Roosevelt was an enemy of the big business trusts. He knew the nation was more than ready to rein them in, and so he decided to go after one of the biggest of them all, Standard Oil, and its director, John D. Rockefeller.
He became the kind of lightning rod for all the things that were wrong with industrial development.
In 1909, the Supreme Court turned to the Sherman Antitrust Act to bring Standard Oil down. Breaking up so enormous a company so pervasive in American life would be a monumental task.
I think that at the time, the Standard Oil decision was viewed as a real blow to Standard Oil and a victory for the public. And I think that that view was a misperception.
The breakup formed a group of smaller but still powerful companies dominant in their regions. Standard Oil of New Jersey became Esso, now Exxon. Standard of Ohio became Sohio. Standard of Indiana became Amoco. Standard of New York became Mobil. Standard of California became Chevron. And Continental Oil became Conoco. All in all, 34 different companies were created out of Standard Oil, and John D. had a piece of every one of them.
He didn't fight it. They kind of made a joke about it afterwards. He sent out to all his lieutenants a kind of fake obituary saying, oh, that this thing is passed on and we must mourn its passing and that sort of thing, but it was a kind of catty and sarcastic and not very serious response.
What Senior had to take seriously was the new way America would light its homes.
All this oil that Rockefeller was refining, he was refining basically into kerosene. And then comes Thomas Edison, who has a vision. He wants to change the way illumination takes place in homes, in businesses, and factories. And he succeeds in doing this by coming up with the electric light. And really, just by luck, the dominant design in auto manufacture at the turn of the century turns out to be the internal combustion engine. The internal combustion engine is fueled by gasoline. Gasoline is refined from petroleum. So just as he is losing the core market that he has, another market, at least as great, comes along, and the business keeps growing.
The wholesale transformation of America into a nation on wheels would make Rockefeller the richest man in the world.
It is said that he was worth between $850 and $950 million in 1911. The gross national product that year was about $35 billion. So think of somebody being worth 1/35th or 1/40th of the U.S. GNP.
But Rockefeller's reputation among his countrymen was only declining as his millions increased. He had become so despised that he finally decided to do something about it. And so he hired the patrician Southerner Ivy Lee to reverse his public image. An early master of public relations, Lee used the media, which the muckrakers had used to disgrace Rockefeller, to turn him into a sympathetic figure. Ivy Lee recognized early the power of the new moving picture and used newsreels to show a remarkably benevolent Rockefeller.
I am very grateful to you and to a host of people who are so kind and good to me all the time.
Why, because you're so good to everybody.
Yes, you are.
As Ivy Lee began to kind of control his public image, he became oddly a kind of American character. And people kind of warmed to him in a bizarre sort of way. It was like having Frankenstein on the loose walking around New York City or something like that with a cane and a long hat.
Although this plane never takes off, this photo opportunity was presented as Senior's first flight. Perhaps Ivy Lee's most brilliant public relations move was the casting of Rockefeller as the man who gave out dimes.
Don't you give a dime, Mr. Rockefeller? Oh, please. Go ahead. You read a dime?
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. I consider myself...
Thank you for the ride.
I consider myself more than amply paid.
Bless you, bless you,
Yes.
bless you.
Unselfish devotion to the common good and belief in God. As a nation, looking proudly to our past, for it has been noble, and recognizing with humility our mistakes of extravagance, selfishness, and indifference, these are days when many are discouraged. In the 93 years of my life, depressions have come and gone. Prosperity has always returned and will again. Let us, with faith in God, in ourselves, and in humanity, go forward, courageously resolved to play our part worthily in building a better world.